Welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. Hey all, welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. As always, our podcasts are brought to you by Gunfighter Gun Oil. I've got a super cool guest today. This is one of my favorite channels that I view on social media, on YouTube in particular, but you're also on Instagram and Facebook, I believe, right, Lance?
Instagram and Facebook, and we'll see what else we're doing. We're putting stuff up on Rumble now. We're all over the social media stuff.
Diversifying. The history guy.
The history guy, yep.
So people that follow me, I'm constantly, what I was just shuffling here was stacks of things that I printed and researched. This is some stuff that I was working on from 1951 race riot in Chicago. So I'm always talking about history, and I actually go to your channel because you do an excellent job researching, and actually you predicate the opener of your pod, or not your podcast, but of your videos by saying that you have a degree in history. So you're not.
Yes, that's the old one. That when we started, say I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, I don't want to overstate the importance of the degree because it's just a bachelor's degree. I really consider myself a storyteller and a lover of history, but I don't think you have to have a degree in history to be a very good historian, because there's just so many people out there that love history and it's a passion, and that's what's most important to it. So the idea of that was, and of course I was starting, I had no idea what to do, but the idea was to show not that I have some important credential, but to show that I had a passion for what we were doing. And the real vision is that, history doesn't have to be boring. It can be, there's so many great stories. It can be great. It can be interesting. It can be moving. And there's so much out there. There's so much out in movies and television and social media. There's so many ways that you can get stories these days, but quite frankly, most every story that someone wrote is less interesting than a story that someone actually lived at some point in history, and that's sure. What I like to bring.
Being a college-trained historian, even with a bachelor's, I think there is something to that, though. Facebook's a good example. People often send me quotes and quips from founding fathers. And I've read and researched enough. I'll see it and I'll go, that's completely out of context of what you're talking about. Like, you took that thing, and so in school you probably learned how to draw out some of the truth versus what modern people.
It is. I mean, there's the study of historiography, which is really that's the business of history and how we study history, and that's one of the things that you can certainly study in college. But I mean, it's still easy to stumble onto things that turn out not to be terribly accurate. I mean, what we do on YouTube is largely not primary research; it's secondary research. So that is to say, I'm producing an episode like every 2 days, so I don't have time to go find witnesses and look up original documents. And I mean, all of my research is going on online on the web.
And you're probably watching, you're watching YouTube and taking notes.
Well, I try not to take things from other YouTubers. I really do, but I mean, I do. The place that I use YouTube the most is to try to pronounce things correctly, and I still get things wrong all the time because there's so many things out there that no one's ever bothered to make a pronunciation guide for. But I mean, today you can go to something and then you can the next day read about it in the paper, and what the paper said doesn't match what you experienced just the day before. So I mean, the same thing's true if I go find a paper from 1950 or 1750. That might be the closest to primary research, and it could still be totally messed up. I mean, it could be because it's always been around. It could be straight up fake news. It could have been someone that was making stuff up, or it could be just something where the newspaper reporter either had an opinion, or the newspaper reporter didn't understand what was going on. So even if I go back in time, and even I go back and find what people said in time, does that accurately represent time? We don't know. And so it's very easy. There's a number of quotations, one of the ones you mentioned out there that I mean, some of the sites, if you go look those up, will be very clear about where it came from, and it came from a letter and it has meaning. But a lot of them don't. A lot of them just put in sentences here and there, and they sound all exciting. Then when you go and find out their context, you're right, they're out of context, or sometimes they're just not actually even real. It's something that someone made up along the way, or someone paraphrased along the way. Or it used to be around the turn of the century, it was very common to do these. It would be a two-sided sheet that would be filled with quotations. And those were used as kind of propaganda pieces in campaigns and things like that. And a lot of times those would mix up the quotations coming from people. And so there's a number of quotations that say people attribute to Lincoln, where it turns out actually that was a 2-page sheet where there were some Lincoln quotations on one side, there were some quotations from a Methodist minister on the other side, and those have become conflated. And so that's the pitfall as a historian. My goal is to go out and try to sort through that and to come to the most accurate story I can come to, and try not to judge the story, but to tell the story. But there's always going to be flaws in that, because no matter how you tell a story, someone's telling the story from a perspective, right?
Right. That's interesting. So like in what we do, there's a lot of guys that have started YouTube channels, and they analyze video footage. And so they analyze the video footage, maybe of some violent act like a robbery or something like that, and they break it down, and it's very exciting to listen to. Here's what's about to happen. Here's what just happened. Here's what happened. But it's all from the perspective of a lens that's up in the corner of a convenience store, not from the perspective of what anybody saw that's in the images. But then we make judgments. That guy over there did the wrong thing because of XYZ. Well, that guy never saw what was actually happening, because
absolutely. And the people in the story, they don't have the benefit of being able to stop it and slow it down and back up and then say, this is what's going to happen. I mean, they're reacting in the moment. So, I mean, that's true. I mean, today we can document things more than ever before, because it seems like whatever happens, there's either a camera or a body cam on a police officer, or someone's got a cell phone. But even then, it's all coming from a perspective. And we see that because all the time we will see pieces where they've cut just a piece of footage, and then when you see the whole piece of footage, it's completely different storyline than what it looked like when they gave the piece. That's what they put online. So that's it's just true in life. You can easily go to someone, I mean, even like a good friend or your wife or somebody, and have a conversation, and then an hour later find out that both of you perceive that conversation completely differently. And history is the same way. I mean, it's always going to come from some perspective, and there's always going to be someone else who has a different perspective.
The scary thing, or maybe interesting is a better word, all of the means of communication and documentation we have now, we still get stuff wrong. So how much is wrong from the Civil War era, or go back 1,000 years?
We do some stuff that actually wanders back into what you would call ancient or prehistory, and most of it's wrong. I mean, if you want to understand, say, what Roman armor was like, there's very few sets of Roman armor out there. What they do is they found a piece here on this battlefield, and they found a piece there on that battlefield. And when you find that piece, you don't know if that's representative of the other 6,000 soldiers who were at the battle. You don't know who wore it, and yet we have to try to, divine from there. This is how the Romans were.
One guy made some modifications to his individual.
Yeah, or he's wearing his grandfather's hat, and it doesn't look anything like anybody else's hat. Or he was the rich guy and bought the nice hat, and that's the hat that they dug up, and they're like, oh, this is the Roman hat. You really don't know. And anything like Roman historians, there's a lot of Greek and Roman historians, but I mean, they were always writing propaganda all the time. They were writing for a specific audience, and they were willing to alter things to fit that specific audience. So and they also were writing from a perspective. When they're writing about someone they're fighting, of course, it's always a barbarian that they know nothing about. It's not written from the barbarian side. So when we go to this historical record, it's sparse. There's things that are just missing. There could be huge chunks that never had anything written about them, or that didn't survive. And what is written is all going to have, its accuracy issues that wouldn't have been true at the time. So we did an episode a long time ago. I did an episode on the war elephants of Carthage, which I think is an interesting story, because we really don't know.
I saw that one.
What kind of elephant. We don't know what species of elephant Hannibal used. We have no idea for sure whether that was an African elephant or an Asian. There are different arguments, or whether it was a species of elephant that's extinct now that might have existed or might not have existed. And it's interesting because the biologists have a different opinion than the historians have as an opinion of it. But there's a great story of the last battle at Carthage, where they had all these elephants, and the Romans figured out how to deal with the Carthaginian elephants. And it really is, when you look at it, it's really hard to believe that if Carthage had access to that many elephants, that they wouldn't have used them in other battles in that campaign. And the entire battle might be fabricated. It might be something that a Roman historian brought back to write, to talk about how fantastic the armies of Rome were, and they might not even have fought a battle. They might have just walked into the city, and everybody gave up because they were out of elephants. So you do the best you can, and I hope. I mean, but even today, there's plenty of people and plenty of channels that are trying to do the best they can to tell the story accurately. But there's plenty of people and plenty of channels who are very biased and are trying to tell the story that serves their purposes. And how's a historian like me in 50 years or 100 years going to be able to pick out and tell whether that's true? And that's in a world where things are caught on video. So you're right. I'm only guessing when I talk about things that happened in the Civil War. There's a lot of stuff that's written down. There's a lot of stuff that's in letters. There's a lot of stuff that's recorded. There are some photographs and things like that. But still, when you're that far removed, you know, a lot of the story is guess. And the farther back you go, the more this guesswork as you go.
I often look like when I'm reading, maybe it'd be something that you spoke about, or reading something that an historian at any point in time drafted. I look for points where I am discerning whether or not they injected their opinion or feelings. Like the document I was just reading, I could tell the author was extremely biased to the protagonist of the story and very spiteful to the antagonist of the story. And literally, like, they used words like talking about one of the quote unquote bad guys, depending on what side of the story you were on. They called him hate-filled. Well, how do you know he was hate-filled? So yeah, talking about the perspective of the person drafting or documenting the history, it's interesting. You start to pay attention to like the almost the inflection of their writing, and you can see the bias. And then when I see that, it's like, well, now I don't know if I even want to read this person's stuff, because you can see the slant that they put on it. You talked a minute ago about like what the Romans and the other ancients, the biases that they would put into talking about barbarians and such to paint a picture a certain way. It sounds exactly like the news now.
It does, yeah. Well, you know, I can say, because philosophically, I try not to have a bias. I try to go at every story as if I don't have an opinion about this story. That's my goal. But I know that that's an unrealistic goal, that you're always going to have your opinions. They're always going to work their way in there somewhere, as well as there's going to be the opinions of the place where we derive the research. So I think even if you are trying to scrupulously avoid that, I mean, there's still going to be some of that seeping in. But there's an awful lot where they're not trying to avoid that at all. I mean, your opinion drives how you perceive the events. And we certainly see that. I mean, there's a lot of topics that I've taken on you know, you can try to do what I'm hoping to do, which is to try to tell the story as accurately as it seems to be recorded. But there's going to be people who themselves have that perspective, and they're going to say that I'm wrong because I don't match their perspective. And on some of those, there's perspective on, you know, two different sides. And so there's no way you were going to be right, because if you were right, you know, as far as this person's concerned, you're wrong as far as this person's concerned. That's life. That's yeah, anybody who's been married knows that that's how life works. Anyone who's had kids know that, or had a dog knows that you can see things from the same event from two different perspectives. And so it's a challenge, and it's more of a challenge maybe today because there's so many channels that someone who doesn't even try still has a voice too. And you have to, as a listener, all you have to do is try to be media savvy and try to, as much as you can, figure out how their perspective might, you know, change the vision of the event so that you can get the most unbiased perspective that you can find. And it's not easy. It's one of the great challenges of our time, I think, in many ways. But I do say that I'm not aiming to come in and present some perspective that says that history is this or that. I'm aiming to come in and try to tell the story as accurate as it can tell a story.
We were talking before we started recording about some of the behind the scenes of YouTube channels and what we do. And because anybody can have access to it, you can have a cell phone and an internet connection, and you can have a channel. And actually, you can have a really big one without anything fancy or any real editing or production skills. There's a misconception, and I see it often because I'll talk to people and folks say, oh, wow, you've got a couple 100,000 subscribers. You must be not, I don't know if important is the word, but authentic or real. And we have this perception of viewership or followership somehow equates to validation, and it doesn't. And it can, but you're just talking about other channels. There's a few history related programs that I've looked at. It's like, well, that's flat out like junk. Like, nobody believes what that person just said. but they record it and it gets a gazillion views, and then
that's right. Maybe it's just fun, or maybe it's people who share the perspective. And I want to be fair here, because I do mess up all the time. Every time I put up a video, I wait to see which comment's going to say what I got wrong.
Is your wife listening to you right now?
No, she's not. She's not telling me that. But I am married. You know, it is, so I am wrong quite often. That's part of life. But I do. Every time I put up a video, I'm wondering what mistake did I make. Sometimes I just transcribe a date or something like that, but other times, you know, I'll say something, I'll have to look it up, and I find out that's not quite where it is. And the reason I chose the name The History Guy is because even though I did anything but this for many years, I would always just be telling people stories about history, and people would say, "Oh, you should do that for a living," and I would laugh and say, "If I knew how to do that for a living, I would." And then YouTube came along, but I find that a lot of those stories I used to tell that I had a lot of fun telling, now I go and research them and find out I was telling them, you know, well off base. So no one's going to be, you know, perfect in information. I mean, it's just, there's too many opportunities to mess up. And you know, I produce 3 episodes a week, so we don't have a month to go, you know, recheck our scripts. But you can be on YouTube and you can be 100% wrong. You can be completely telling things wrong, and you might pick up an audience because that's what people want to hear. Or you might pick up an audience just because you're a lot of fun. Or, I mean, it is an interesting kind of a wild westy place. I've always understood that I could strap a GoPro to my cat and probably get more subscribers.
I'm doing it. I don't even have a cat. I'm getting one.
You're getting one, yeah. So I mean, that's honestly
The Adventures of Tinkerbell.
Yep, those are those channels that do very, very well. That I mean, there's a channel that my daughter loves, or showed me once at least, where all this woman did is she followed her little dog around all day, and she videotaped with a GoPro every time the dog misbehaved. And she's got, you know, large. I don't want to downspeak this channel or anything like that. I mean, it's and so if you want to go in the library and belch out loud and record people's reactions, you can probably have a successful YouTube channel, because there's people who want to watch that. And so it doesn't. I mean, the subscribers, first of all, don't necessarily track to income. I don't think people understand that in YouTube. Subscribers does not necessarily mean views, does not necessarily mean income. Yeah. But also, subscribers doesn't necessarily mean that you're authentic. It just means that you've managed to do something that someone enjoys and wants to watch.
True. But in that, buyer beware. You get what you pay for. And so when you go to a place where you have this pretty much unfettered access where anybody can post anything, you have to be able to deduce what's fact from fiction and what's right and wrong, especially if you're
media literacy. But I mean, that predates the internet.
Sure, yeah.
Fake news goes back a very long time, and fake news essentially got us into the Spanish-American War. Gave us a completely false story about how the USS Maine blew up. And so that's always
tell a little bit of that story. That's a good story. Tell a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean,
most Americans don't even know a thing about that war.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it is kind of a forgotten war, the Spanish-American War, and it had to do with 30 years they had been having rebellions in Cuba, and the United States seriously involved because there were economic interests and because it was close to our borders. But really what happened is at some point it sold more newspapers to get us into the war than it did to not get us into the war. And so newspapers really agitated us into a war. That ended up being a fairly costly war. And we lost a lot more of our soldiers to disease than we lost to combat. But we lost a lot of them to disease. And it really is kind of a forgotten time in American history, because that then drew us into being a colonial power in the Philippines, which drove us into decades of war. And wars that I don't think Americans would have chosen if they really knew what we were getting into at the time. But it really, so, you know, the simple story there is that a U.S. battleship was in Havana Harbor. The battleship blew up, and almost certainly from every post review of the wreckage, almost certainly blew up because they had used bituminous coal, which can self-combust, and that had started a fire which caused the magazine to explode. It was an accidental explosion aboard the Maine. But very quickly, of course, newspapermen knew they would sell more papers if they said the Spanish had attacked and blown up the ship, and then that's what agitated us into war. I mean, that's the short story of it. But I mean, those stories go back in time. And as a matter of fact, if you go farther back, when the media was controlled, then you have even more bias, because there were groups of people who didn't allow other information in, and so they could tell.
You're talking about in the U.S. or abroad?
Oh, all over the world. I mean, if you want to go to Roman times, or if you want to go to the U.S., there's always been times when there were people who controlled the media. Maybe, I mean, we've been more free here in the United States, but I mean, there's some discussion now that there's this argument that's kind of made that says that the politics are so divisive now because there are so many news channels. And it used to be, if you go back to the 70s, there were only the 3 networks. And therefore, even though people might disagree about how you interpret things, we all agreed on the same facts. And there's people who argue like that was a better time. Well, I mean, the bottom line is those 3 networks weren't completely reliable. It's easy to go back now and see how they were operating from various agendas, and that having less news was not necessarily better. Again, I don't want to take a political stand, but I want to say it's dangerous to say that if we all agree on the truth, then it's going to be easier for us all to agree, because there is no single truth. Yeah. And going back to one newspaper called Pravda, called Truth, is very dangerous, and I mean it's got a dangerous history. And that is kind of always been the case. It's always been the case that you had to be media literate, that you had to look out for biases. One of the things, I mean, I went to grad school in communication, and one of the things that we talked about, and it was interesting because it was so different in the world before electronic media, but we talked about newspapers. And one of the things that was interesting about newspapers is events that happen on a Tuesday might not be news, whereas if the same event happened on a Saturday, it might be news. And the reason is, on Sunday newspaper, you had all the ad supplements. And so you had to fill a larger newspaper. And so you had to have more news. And so if you did something on Saturday, it would make the Sunday paper. If you did it on Friday, the Saturday paper was very thin. And so they might say that's not news. And you do the exact same thing on Saturday, and the Sunday paper has to be very thick, and they'll say that's news. And if you don't understand that, then you really don't understand what news is. So media literacy has always been important, and it's more important today because anybody can say anything out there on the internet, and that can go out there into the world, and then people can make decisions based on that, and that could be dangerous.
For years, I've told people, especially in my time in politics, that media, even sports, it's all entertainment, but it's all meant to sell ads. Even what we're doing now, it exists so that Google can monetize the conversations.
Absolutely,
and things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think people, when you understand from that perspective, the stuff that was curated and put in that magazine or into that blog or whatever it is, now it's the 24 news cycle, is to catch your attention, to sell you toilet paper or tires or whatever else.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's
how you get your news. That has always been the case, and it's always been, what sells the paper is not necessarily what is objective truth, and or what sells the news story, what sells television. I mean, it's not always. And you're right, everything is going to be. I mean, the old story is simply this way, and that is that bad news is more news than good news. I mean, if you do something wonderful, you're less likely to get on the news station than if you do something horrible, just because horrible stuff sells more papers. And that's always given us a skewed kind of vision of how the world works.
And people complain about it, but then people keep watching.
Yeah, people. If the train wreck's nearby, you go over to see the train wreck. I mean, that's just part of that's just human nature, and I mean, there might even be biological explanations for that. But I mean, all they're doing is responding to the audience. So I mean, it's true that also news organizations are owned by people, and those people might have agendas that they're pushing through news organizations. But more often, news organizations are run by money, by what sells, and what they're doing is what attracts the audience. And if you can be more bombastic, you can be more exciting, then you might attract more audience, but that might give a different perspective on life than is the reality. That's just kind of how things have always worked. And we've always tried to say what you really need to do is you need to be an informed consumer of the news. So I came from an era like where my grandparents, if it was in the paper, it was true. I mean, absolutely. And so some of those grandparents are living into the electronic age, and they're reading stuff online, and they're taking that as the same way that they read things in the paper. And it wasn't even true when it was in the paper, but good golly, now just because I saw it on TV. Well, anybody can be on TV.
It's an ongoing job of mine to correct some of my family members' Facebook posts. Like, you just shared that. Did you look where it came from? It's some crazy wacko website. Like, no, an alien did not just shake Donald Trump's hand.
Yeah, there's sites that are, they'll tell you at the top of the site, say we're liars, and then they write them to sound like news, and then people will take that as news and run out with it. Yeah, but it's always been National Enquirers. There was a period during the It's called the Protectorate. There was a period when the Puritans overthrew the king, the monarchy in England, and for a while that was ruled by Parliament under Oliver Cromwell. And one of the interesting things about that period, the Puritans were, I mean, they were very strict. I think banned Christmas, and you were supposed to walk around and never, essentially, in England. But one of the things is that they actually controlled newspapers more under the monarchy than they did under the Puritans. And so if you look in the period of the Protectorate, there's a lot of newspapers that look a lot like the old Weekly World News or the National Enquirer. The stuff that you start seeing in newspapers is like a mermaid was swimming up the Thames and 100 people saw this mermaid. So that's the sort of stuff that came out when they uncontrolled, because that was the sort of stuff that they bought. This has always been human nature. It goes back to the start. I did an episode once on the Beast of Gévaudan, which is this story back in 18th century France where some sort of critter, whether it was wolves or whether it was a very large wolf or whether it was something else, killed a bunch of people. And it's still a big question of what was the Beast of Gévaudan. But the real idea is this was kind of the beginning of newspapers, and they had these things called broadsheets where they were just printing them. It would be a huge, like double, like a full newspaper-sized sheet. And they would have this, incredibly, a ridiculous picture of some sort of gigantic beast that was ravaging the countryside, and then that causes terror. And when that's what people are, expecting, what they're fearing, then the dog or the wolf that took the sheep could look like the Beast of Gévaudan. So from the beginning, people have told these stories. From the beginning, these stories, they titillate, they excite, and then they draw more attention, and then that gives them more credibility than maybe they deserve. And that's always been that way. And is it worse today or better today? In some ways it's worse because anyone can say anything, but in some ways it's better because anyone can research anything and go out and debunk what they've seen. And the real question is not, is the media good or bad? The real question is, how do we use it? And it's very, very powerful. And we are able to change the world in ways we never were able to change the world before because of it. I mean, the way that we share medical information today is just something, I mean, even 20 years ago was nothing like this ability. And so that if you have an illness that's a 1 in a million illness, it's so much better chance now that it's going to be accurately diagnosed because of the same media. So the real question is not the tool. The question is how we use the tool.
Just some of the stuff you just talked about is why I so enjoy history, not from more of a philosophical approach. We constantly hear this repeated stuff about the good old days or we're getting so bad. You just were talking about Cromwell. I think you did a video on him. Was it one about 3 different bodies?
Yeah, that was
that? Like
on Cromwell, but
like
he was the Lord.
It was him, a queen.
It was. I'm trying to remember. We do so many episodes.
It was him, a queen, and then was it like a Wild West cowboy outlaw kind of guy?
I'm trying to remember what all 3 of them were. The queen was the last wife of Henry VIII.
Yeah,
and she ended up being just buried in a chapel, and her body was kind of forgotten. And then when it was rediscovered, people just kept digging it up for salacious reasons. She ended up
picking parts off of her.
Yeah, taking hair and stuff like that. And she ended up being, she'd been so perfectly preserved, she ended up being just a pile of dust. But Cromwell is one of those, that he went from being the hero of the nation to, with the Restoration, he became the villain of the nation. And they dug up his body, which had been buried in Westminster Abbey. They dug up his body, they hanged the body, the dead corpse, and then they stuck the head up on a mic, and it disappeared one day, and then it traveled around, and they think they eventually found it, although there's some argument over whether that was his head or that was his head. There were different heads around. So they get the head they think is the head, and eventually they shoved it in a wall at a university somewhere so that no one would go mess with the head. And that's how fast a reputation can change. And so if you looked at how people talked about Cromwell in one period as opposed to another period, there would be completely different stories. And so many historical figures that we know, we only get that perspective written by someone 100 years later who might have a completely different idea of what they were.
Wasn't there, didn't have his mom and dad talking in his ear about the evil Cromwell or evil king.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, or what a wonderful person they were. Yeah,
yep.
Yeah. And that's like that story. I listened to that and it's fascinating. Like the queen, people digging her up, pulling parts of her body off as souvenirs, and then folding the coffin back up and putting it back in the ground for a bit. And people think, oh, we're savages now, we're horrible. I don't know anybody that's digging up dead bodies and hanging them. Like we're much kinder.
We are, yes. Well, we also did one on the Harrison horror, where President Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, his father had died. He was a congressman at the time; he wasn't president yet, but his father had died. His father was the son of a president, and he was the father of a president. And when he died, they buried him, and they created a vault because they knew there were body snatchers out there. The medical schools would dig up the bodies for medical research, and someone who was there apparently watched how they did it and still dug up the body. And so they actually found their father's body hanging in this medical school. We don't do that anymore. Like, lucky us. We figured out ways. Now people write on their license, donate my body to science, and then when you die, they got someone that they can go and show medical students where the parts are without stealing them out of. Yeah. So I mean, that's one of the stories I like to tell, or one of ideas about history is that no matter how bad things, how cruel people seem now, humanity has survived worse. We have survived, of course, far worse pandemics than the one we're facing now. I mean, not trying to downplay COVID, but I mean, it's nothing compared to the 1918 pandemic or, the smallpox. You just assume that 2/3 of the population will get smallpox and a third of those that got it would die. We just that was how we figured things were going to happen. And every 100 years or so, then the Black Death would come through and wipe out the city, and then we'll just move back in after they're dead and buried. So if you want to talk about how hard 2020's been, I understand that it's probably been the most difficult year in a generation. But I mean, if you lived through, say, 1917 to 1919 in the United States, you would think it's laughable. Sure. What we're complaining about.
Or the Dust Bowl, the Depression.
The Dust Bowl. Well, you were talking about a race riot in 1950. If you want to look at what's going on now, Black Lives Matter and all that's going on, and of course it causes a lot of tension in the nation, but it's nothing compared to the Red Summer of 1919.
Oh, I just was reading about some of this stuff. There's a small black child puts a raft into Lake Michigan. It drifts into the part of the lake that's whites only, and mothers start chucking rocks at his head until he
drowns. And then it turns into a riot where dozens of people, or hundreds, were injured and dozens were killed, and they had to bring the National Guard in to bring order back to Chicago.
Just horrible.
Yeah, so I mean that's not what's going on today. At least
this is the one I was reading about, the Cicero riots, 1951. The family was Harvey Clark. Him and his family. You ever hear that story? I
don't know that story.
That's be a worthwhile one for you reading. This is the one where I found a lot of bias. But the guy tries to take his young family. He's a World War II vet. Move into an apartment in Cicero, which was predominantly white. The people there don't want him to move in. Bunch of up to 4,000 protesters come and literally toss all of their belongings out the window, burn their piano that they saved and bought so their daughter could learn piano, then torch the whole apartment building, and then destroy like the whole section of town. The sheriffs and National Guard and all that have to come out, all because the guy wants to rent an apartment. And like that, people see that, they would. And
it might surprise them because that's going on in Chicago, and we thought, the North is enlightened. It's the South that was racist. When Martin Luther King came up to march in Chicago, he said, "I've never seen racism like I saw in Chicago." But I mean, that was also just how people expected things at the time, how they saw things at the time. People really thought that the morals of the nation would fall apart if we started mixing the races. And we've moved you could, no matter what you want to say about all the politics that we talk about in terms of race relations today, you can't say that we haven't moved forward at least huge, vast steps from even say 50 years ago. But I've still heard people say, things are no better now than they were during slavery. And I'm like, I just want to say this story, and I think you probably don't understand how bad it was.
I drive a lot across the country, and I try to stop and look at local history. I was in Macon, Georgia, a month ago, and north of Macon a little bit, I forgot the name of the town. It was a huge plantation. So my nephew, who was with me, he and I went and visited the plantation, and just reading, they documented the lives of some of the slaves that were there. It's like unfathomable. Or we stopped at a cave near Mammoth Cave and read the history of a man who was a slave. His white owner forced him to do tours for over 30 years. He'd take people and tours in the cave, but they told the story of how he had children and his children were taken away from him. And it's horrible to read because none of us can imagine our kids being taken and sold. And during the time of the Civil War, a general comes by there, or maybe he was a colonel. Now I'm recreating history. An officer interviews this guy, and he says, well, the kids being taken away probably didn't really affect you because, you know, you black people don't have feelings the same as us.
Yeah.
And
a Union officer saying that?
Yeah. And so, and it was a Union officer. So this man, I forgot his name. It was a great story, though. I took some pictures of the monument that was there to him. But basically he said, well, it doesn't do me any good because I can't do anything about it, but it hurts something fierce. Like, of course it's terrible, but you hear that. I can't imagine somebody being made to give tours in a dark cave for 30 years and then have their kids sold.
Yeah. Yes. The kids sold like they're a calf, you know?
Yeah.
And
that was the other thing. The officers that was doing this writing, they didn't even call them children. They were like livestock, like chattel. They didn't even call them children because they didn't look at the black offspring the same as white offspring. It's horrible.
And that's supposedly the enlightened side of the Civil War. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's if you understand, I mean, if you go, and of course, slavery is pretty much as old as civilization. But if you look back, I mean, at say slavery in the 17th century in America, really the attitude that starts to form, and especially the attitude that distinguished between, say, indentured servants and slaves, the attitude that starts to form is that if you are a slave, that means that you have done something to put yourself in that position, and you essentially deserve it. You are somehow less than civilized, not necessarily less than human, but less than civilized in such a way that you have to endure slavery in order to move into the civilized space. And so there are stories where, you know, Puritans were captured by Native Americans and then they were enslaved. And when they get free, now their neighbors don't look at them the same way anymore because you have to have done something in order to have been enslaved. And that seems so horrible today, but I mean, at the time, that's what they had to do to tell themselves in order to own slaves and not be, you know, absorbed by their own guilt over that. And it's astounding that you think that people could process information that way in a way that made it feel like, you know, I'm moral for owning a slave. And that's, I mean, there's still, you know, human trafficking today, and I don't know how people explain that to themselves as they go and do it today. But we, you know, sensibilities have changed so much over time that we're absolutely appalled by that. But I mean, that was how all your neighbors thought at some period in history. And if we think that we're unenlightened today, certainly we think we are enlightened today compared to what we saw in the past.
I get a lot of people that get mad or direct anger towards me when I bring up colonial history, because it's easy to take, like, here's one good thing that happened, the light of liberty that we're creating for mankind here, but then to say, oh, well, these people were evil, they were slaveholders. And I don't at all dismiss that, but I like the way I think about it is I can't judge through the optics of what I know today, what they did then. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's some fairness to it. I mean, also, to be fair, though, when you talk about those anachronistic ideas, is that there were people at the time who knew slavery was wrong.
Heck yeah.
And there were, I mean, you know, Washington had slaves. He was in Virginia. But if you went across the border into Pennsylvania, the Quakers had figured out that slavery was wrong. And one of the problems that Washington had is that when he was president in Philadelphia, if he took his slaves to Philadelphia, he was afraid he would lose his slaves. That they would become free there. So it really, though, you know, what I say is I don't think that there's anybody today, and I don't think there's anybody in the past who wasn't just, you know, basically a human, or in that to say that what do you say? You say that Washington was a horrible slave, that Washington was this, you know, with this great person, and I kind of grew up when the schooling about Washington was the guy who supposedly threw $1 across the Delaware River and cut down a cherry tree and said he could never tell a lie, and he wasn't that guy. But he wasn't a horrible guy either. He was a creature of his times, and you have to understand him as a creature of his times and understand where he had to move as a creature of his time. And I think when you do that, then you find out that he is, if anything, at least a good story. I mean, in some ways, it's a better story to find out that there were things that we would consider very flawed about his character today. But there were things that he would consider very flawed about our character today, and maybe we all can learn from both. But I do agree with you that you do make a mistake if you judge too much based on modern sensibilities how someone behaved in the past, because they were facing different challenges and completely different sensibilities, and they grew up in a different life where they faced different things and they learned different things. It's true, but some of that can go too far. I mean, we knew, for example, the Japanese internment during the Second World War. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways to talk about that and to talk about how the nation can move to that and how the Supreme Court could justify that. But when you talk about was that moral, you can't just say, talk about that a little bit. Time in the period it was different, because there were plenty of people at the time who knew that that was wrong and who expressed that that was wrong. So it wasn't like
talk about the internment a little bit, so people listening, because sadly a lot of people don't know anything about that.
Yeah, during the Second World War, essentially what we did, I mean, the very brief version of it is that we were afraid that anyone of Japanese heritage could be a spy for Japan, and so we took property and homes, and we herded Japanese American citizens into camps and interned them. I mean, they weren't anything like, say, the German extermination camps or anything like that. They were essentially, prisoner camps. They were fed. They had medical care. I mean, it wasn't, but it was, people were deprived entirely of their liberty and their property merely because of their heritage. And at the time, it was justified, saying that was a national defense measure. And some even justified saying that there was so much hatred for Japan after the bombing of Pearl Harbor that we were protecting these citizens from other Americans who would be violent towards them because of their heritage. But however you want to put it, for the most part, that property was never given back to them. I mean, we somewhere along the order of 60 years later, we gave some money back. We paid some compensation, but it wasn't close to what those families had lost. And it's an interesting discussion to talk about how did this nation that presumed to say that we were fighting to make the world free, that this was a war for democracy, how did this nation do something like deprive tens of thousands of our citizens? I honestly don't know the number. I have to look it up. I'm probably underestimating there. It might have been as much.
It was tens of thousands or more.
Yeah, but I mean, it was at least many thousands of our citizens, completely deprive them of their liberty and their property and treat them as if they were dangerous aliens. Some of them had lived here for generations. And some of them never got that. I mean, they had spent generations, say, creating orchards or businesses, and they never got those businesses back. And so when you look at that and when you judge that, you have to have an eye on what was going on at the time and what were people thinking at the time. You have to have an eye on the anachronism. But you also
120,000.
120,000. I didn't recall if it was over 100,000. I mean, 120,000 people. I mean, imagine that. Imagine if today, if we herded 120,000 citizens who have lived here for generations just because of the color of the skin in the camps, that you would think it was horrible. So when you look at it, you have to take in account what was going on at the time, but you can't just use that as an excuse, because even at the time, there were people who knew that that was the wrong thing. And that eventually went to the Supreme Court. The Korematsu decision is really considered one of the most horrendous decisions ever made by the court, which was to say that it was okay as a matter of national security to intern the Japanese Americans.
I love those kinds of stories. I want to make this point real quick, because constantly we hear younger people, like younger than like 40, that because we're in this huge time now of everything's legal, right? Pot's legal, same-sex marriage is legal, and I'm not suggesting those things should be legal or illegal. I'm just stating that they are. And so people assume going further back, everything was legal, but like any infringement upon one's right now is looked at as some great heinous crime by government, and stuff like that happened in World War II era.
Yeah, what would you say is the modern era, in our grandparents' era, lifetimes at least, yeah.
Which is quite horrible. I mean, that's no different than marching Native Americans across the plains. It's the same.
True, which was a 19th century horror too, yeah. It's hard to, if you look at we still call them the Indian Wars, even though you wouldn't want to call a Native American an Indian. But if you look at the Indian Wars, I mean, it really is an interesting time to understand how Americans felt like this was our land and we could just go take it away. But I mean, there's a lot of horror in that. So it could be that an unscrupulous vile person came through and either cheated or murdered or something, and then you're just the next family coming through. and those natives, don't know the other guy. They just know that you're the same color as him, and they might, murder your family. And you can see how that turns into the horror. I mean, the point where Phil Sheridan, essentially he gave away these coins with a picture of an Indian on them because as a reward to anyone who killed an Indian, and said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And he established the strategy that says that if we could eradicate the buffalo herds, we would be able to herd the Indian onto the reservations. And there are massacres. There's all sorts of horrible things that are going on. Like Korematsu and the Japanese internment, if you look at it on the whole, it is more complex than it appears. It wasn't just evil, Snidely Whiplash white guys riding up and murdering people. That happened, but that happened inside the context of a broader movement. But like understanding the Japanese internment, you can't simply write it off and say, oh, that's how we did things in 1870, so it's fine, because there were plenty of people at the time who looked at it and said, this is wrong. There were plenty of people who participated in those wars who just figured out, this is wrong, this is horrible what we're doing. And what you have to do from a historical standpoint is try to say, how did we move from there to here, and what does that mean? And that's a lot more fruitful discussion than trying to say, they're heroes or villains. They're dead. They're long gone. And the real question is, what does that say to us today? But there seems to be a movement today that would say we'd rather forget that history because it's terrible. We'd rather forget those names because they're terrible. We'd rather forget that there might have been people who did great things and terrible things, and we want to forget the great things because of the terrible things. And as a historian, my instinct is to say, no, we need to remember that, because that can happen again. And we need to remember that because we want to become better people. And we can't forget our past. We can't forget the good in our past because of the bad in our past, but we can't forget the bad in our past because of the good in our past. What we have to understand is that we have a complex past because we face complex situations as humans, and understanding the complexity of the past is what helps inform us about facing the complexity of the present. That's my general idea. And so I don't want to take a side on any particular stand on which statue we're going to take down or anything like that.
Sure,
I
you
just
do.
want to say that my
sure you do. Which statues? Where's your list? Which statues?
There's plenty of them.
I'm just kidding. I said, give me your
one
list.
was just taken down in I think Virginia. That was a copy of a DC statue that was about slaves being released by Lincoln, and it was taken down. It's surprising to me. But I mean, Oregon, most of all, a statue of an elk was taken down. I mean, I don't know what the elk did. And I, again, I don't because people that are doing that are passionate and they have opinions about that, and there's reasons that they're doing that, and I don't want to take sides on that because I really want people to make their own choices. But I can say that if we start to forget everything in history that we don't like, then we are going to be awfully ill-informed about how to face the challenges of our present, because that's the way that we do it. It's like saying I'm not going to learn from my grandfather because he smoked.
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah, I like that analogy. I was reading about Socrates the other day and what led to his demise, and I never knew that whole story about him having this public conversation about democracy not being that great of a thing because any idiot can vote, and any idiot can vote isn't, and this is my interpretation. But talk about like just, what you're talking about right now is making me think about that. We have this unfettered access to information. We're all afforded a vote, and people don't take seriously, I think, how much power we as individuals have in our republic. It's pretty interesting.
I agree in many ways. Again, I don't want to delve too much into the political realm about that. I mean, part of it is too that we're distracted. But I mean, one of the things that's always kind of interesting to me when you talk, say, about voting in the United States. In the United States, we really have this perspective that voting is a right, and we talk about voting rights. And voting is a right in the United States, but it's also a privilege. And historically, it's a great privilege that everybody gets a say in government. And we've seemed to move to this perspective that voting is a right, that we forget that it is still a privilege, that we get to do that, and we need to take it responsibly. And we seem to be more interested in, do you have the right to vote, than are you acting like a good citizen that informs your vote in a way that is going to inform the country? Because if you don't, then you're going to lose that right to vote if you keep, being an uninformed voter. And it's an odd discussion now that I've had a few times where I try to say, I'll try to argue voting is a privilege, and people say, no, it's a right. I say, well, it can be a right and also be a privilege. And if you don't recognize that it's a privilege and treat it as such, then you're going to lose the right. That's my feeling looking at it from a historical perspective.
I have an argument that the way that I explain that to people in my community that have this right versus privilege idea is our rights are all just codified by us, and we can recodify anything we want to if you don't take an active role in it. I like you, I don't care about talking about political viewpoints, but the overall concept of it, whether you think that a pink fairy is the next president or whoever, I don't care. But how you get there, it is important. Talking about YouTube now, people are discussing whether or not it should be regulated. There's a pretty interesting discussion point. I don't know how long ago, 100 years, 200 years, Britain taxed any printed text. So like by those standards, you and I pumping content out onto YouTube because it's analogous to printed text in those days. There was no video. Everything we pump out would be text or taxed and or censored. So
well, to an extent it is, right? I mean, it still is. And I mean, we have those discussions. It took one of the things in terms of like the understanding YouTube is it took us a couple of years and finally actually getting large enough that we became part of the YouTube partner program and really got to be able to talk to people at YouTube before we understood the monetization rules. And that, I always felt like I was being censored. And in the end, what we figured out is that those monetization rules are really built around what advertisers want to pay for.
Yeah.
And they don't want to hear certain. So there's history that if I talk about it, I can't monetize it because they don't want to talk about it. So an odd one was I did one on this last spring on the Sigonella incident, which was after the Achille Lauro hijacking by Palestinians. Then the Palestinians that engaged in the hijacking were put on an airplane in Egypt, and they were going to be flown to Palestine. And President Reagan had us intercept the plane, and we didn't know where to land the plane once we intercepted it. So we landed it at a NATO base in Italy without asking Italy's permission, and ended up in this standoff between American troops and Italian troops. It's an interesting chunk of history, and it's not really well understood. At the time, it was barely reported as what it really was. But I can't monetize that video because it talks about terrorism in the Middle East. So that was 40 years ago. That's still a modern current topic that's controversial, and advertisers don't want to have anything to do with it. And I mean, that kind of that startles me. But at least that rule is based around this idea that they talk to the advertisers, and the advertisers are saying, we're afraid if we attach our name to that, it could hurt us.
So therein lies the issue, though, because people like you, maybe not you, now choose what information to propagate and which to not. So now here's what's repeated into the future. So nobody tells that story anymore because I can't.
Because I won't get ads. And so even as the history guy, that puts perspective into it. And so if you were to take the history guy and to try to take the history guy as the definitive story on history, which I don't hope anybody's going to totally do that. But let's say 100 years from now, all you got is the history guy. You're going to have huge gaps in history based on what YouTube was willing to monetize. Which I
couldn't pay the electric bill if I told that story.
Yeah, if I talked about that, it's too, and it's funny it's bizarre how that works. And some of YouTube's funny because some of those rules have changed. I have to confidential. I'll go back and look at some of my old videos and say, wow, those if they looked at them today, they wouldn't have monetized that.
Sure,
it was different. So, and then in between, then things go, they swing backwards and forwards. That's part of YouTube. But then you also come to the question about, essentially what becomes YouTube censorship, and is that they will literally pull down some videos, and that there are cries to take down more than they're already taking down now. It used to be, that they had trouble catching people that were recruiting for Al Qaeda. And they started to get a grasp on, all sorts of shenanigans were going on. There were also just people that were essentially using this to hide, human trafficking or all sorts of things that they were doing. They got to those, but now you have political voices. YouTube recently decided to pull down videos that talked about election fraud. And I studiously avoid taking positions on things like that. But I do know that much of my audience was offended by that. And a lot of them are no longer watching YouTube, and that impact. So now here's more history that's lost in some ways, because here's again another way that I lose money if I talk about this or that. And then that means that that's stuff that's going to be forgotten going forward. So I don't envy YouTube having to make those decisions. I honestly, I don't blame them, because I think they're caught between a lot of different of forces pulling different directions when they do that. But I can say that even this relatively unfettered channel has its chains in different places. That means that it changes how you see the world, and it changes probably how people in the future will see the world, because they're going to take this as the measurement of that. And it is the challenge. It's always been a challenge. I mean, I said it was a challenge in our newspapers. It's a different challenge today, but it's a challenge of our age. It's to say
liberty goes both ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, liberty without responsibility is a mess. It's anarchy. Yeah.
But you may, I'm just using you may think this thing should be public domain, and I might think it's the most horrible, vile thing. It could be art to you, and it could be disgusting to me. And so I think that's something people need to try to be mindful of as well. Just, I mean, like, if my mother had her way, we would all be in Sunday school 8 days a week, 24 hours a day, but somebody else would, cry separation of church and state. And
yeah, and we try. I think that we try maybe more than any society in history to try to respect different viewpoints.
You do think that? No other. I like this.
I mean, I hate to talk too much in generalities in history, and anytime you say something's the most or the worst or anything like that, then there's something else that pops up. I think that America as a society historically has put more effort into trying to accept a diversity of opinion as a part of our founding philosophy than most other nations. I'll say, and this is wandering into politics more than history usually does, when I go to Europe, I sometimes really think that they don't understand what free speech is, that they don't even get the basic concept of free speech. And so they will create laws against things that we would find just absolutely the opposite of how we perceive the whole idea. I've had people say to me things like hate speech isn't free speech. And my feeling is the whole reason you protect free speech is to protect controversial stuff, or it's valueless. Sure. And so everything is free speech, and I want us to be very careful about anything we pull out of the domain, out of the world domain, because I think that we have to use a marketplace of ideas to come to the best agreement. Now that's me, and that's politics, and other people might disagree, but
I don't know if I'd say that that's politics, Lance. I mean, that's more just your,
because it would be controversial if you talked about it to someone you just had a fairly similar system of government, but just a little bit different. And
Lance,
it's not
sometimes you're going to offend people, brother. It's okay.
Like the Schenck decision, and in wartime we become a lot more strict in how we and part of what's going on today is people essentially see fighting the pandemic as being kind of like wartime, and it justifies more censorship. And there was a period during a couple of different periods in U.S. history where we really tried to essentially shut down anybody who was criticizing the government because we thought it would be bad for the nation. But I think generally philosophically our idea has been that you let the ideas out there and you let people make decisions. And one of those was in the Chicago area, the Skokie trial. That is one of the most interesting parts of history. It just seems to be forgotten, where we as a nation decided that it was okay to let Nazis march. We carried that all the way to the courts. The American Civil Liberties Union argued on behalf of Nazis for the right of people in Nazi uniforms to march through.
And that wasn't that long ago.
That wasn't that long ago. But the reason that we came to the decision, and actually they ended up not marching, but the reason we came to that decision was our understanding that when you start to say what you can and cannot hear, then that becomes a very dangerous path to tread. And then when you let information out there, it becomes a learning experience. We have in Illinois schools, you have to, Holocaust education is a mandate, and that's because of that argument over Nazis marching in Chicago. So, I mean, if we didn't have those kinds of debates, what would we forget? And I think that that's the heart and soul of America. And I think that's part of the vision of what can happen on all of the social media. I think that's, even though I stay away from topics because I don't want them to be controversial or because I need to monetize them or whatever, I still think that part of the whole vision of what we can do today, where so many people can have voices, is to say that really more voices is better than fewer voices, and that we should be very, very careful about removing voices.
I agree. The interesting thing about like the concept, in my opinion, this concept of course, I don't condone being hateful or spiteful, but to somehow saying that is hateful, thus it should be illegal, is literally to legislate one's morals. So now we are like it, which in a sense goes into a religious aspect as well. And that's,
I mean, you know, what's hate and what's not hate is always going to be subjective, and that's why it's a
yeah,
very path. So you're right. I don't want to support people being hateful at all, but I generally feel that people have a right to hate.
yeah, yeah.
You
If
know,
I want to, if
have
I
a right.
want to,
I don't want to punish anyone for their thoughts,
yeah,
and that's, I mean, that I feel is, if you know, if you really understood basic civics in America, that's really what the whole idea on how the nation was structured, the whole idea of the form of government that we try to create, so that you can think what you want to think, and we're not going to punish. Now, we might punish acts, we might punish dangerous acts, but you can think what you want to think.
speaking my language now, Lance.
Yeah,
Hey, what's with the?
I mean, I know that's controversial to some people. It is, and I know it's controversial because that was at the same time that people were also saying you're a slave and I can sell your kids. And so, but I think when you I don't think you should throw out one because of the other. I think we should still look at the value of those things that separated us, and part of the strength of this nation, and part of what allowed this nation to grow, part of what allowed this nation to say, be, you know, part of what saved the world from some horrible things during the world wars. Part of that is that even among all of our disagreements, we still had that general idea that you are free here to think what you want to think, and that might even be horrible things. I mean, because I mean, if you want to think bad things, I mean, as far as I know, you might think things I'm thinking are bad things, and you know, if it comes to a shooting match, then maybe the law needs to be involved. But if it's a matter of your opinion and my opinion, then people can have opinions, even opinions I hate.
Do you think it's a common thread nowadays is people just can't talk to each other, or people can't be civil, or people can't have a discussion or a debate? I have my opinion on that. I think that probably we're better now at that than we were in the past. What do you think?
I think, like most other things, the people who can't are the loudest ones, and so they tend to be, you know, misrepresented. But I honestly, I mean, you can go, and it's funny when you talk about politics. But if you really want to see where the anger and vicious part of the web is, go to one of the sports sites. And if you want to see where all the foul language is, go to the sites where they talk about video games. But I think that in general, though, if you go out in the world, you find out that, you know, your neighbors are reasonable people. And so I think that that's really kind of a loud minority that is so intolerant that they don't let other people have opinions. But I think we're actually better at accepting opinions than we've really been in history. And I think that we've continued to try to move that direction because we understand that its value. So I think you can have a conversation with the vast majority of people. And one of the problems is that too often we're trying to have the conversation with the few that you can't, and then we use them to characterize the others. So whatever you think about George W. Bush, I think one of the most astute comments I've heard in my lifetime was his comment, which says that too often that we judge others by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intents.
That's what he said.
Yeah, he said. I might be paraphrasing, but I mean that's pretty close to what he said. And it's for all you want to say about that president, that is one of the most just this insightful comments that I have seen in my lifetime. Is that understanding?
Say it one more time, Lance.
Too often we judge others by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intents. And, you know, so whoever, if you're getting in a yelling match with someone, when you bring up their bad examples, they're going to be, well, that's not really us. That's just the crazies. And then they're going to say the same thing to you, and you say, that's not really us. That's just the crazies. And why can't you look each other in the eye and say, why don't we ignore the crazies and realize that the vast majority of us are not? And it's hard. It's hard for me when I'm online, and it's not easy to do because it's easy to get drawn into the debate. But I honestly think that the vast majority of us in the nation and in the world are reasonable people who don't want to hurt other people, who want to respect other people's freedoms to be the sort of person that they want to be, and are legitimately trying to figure out policy ways to walk that path. And I don't think that there's any great degree of people. I mean, like you might think. I mean, everybody on both sides. Oh, your side only wants to help these people, and your side only wants to help those people, or whatever. I don't think that actually represents either side.
I agree.
We tend to see their worst examples, judge them by our idea of what their motivation must be, and then they're a villain. and then ignore our worst examples because we're judging by our idea of the best of us and what we're trying to accomplish. And that, I think, is cost. And that's a pitfall of telling history, but it's also a pitfall of telling current events.
I agree with that. What's with the bow tie?
You know, it's funny. When I started with the vision of the channel, I didn't start with a bow tie. At all. But I knew how to tie a bow tie. And actually, going all the way back to college, and I used to do speech and debate in college. So you wore ties, you wore suits then. And so I've known how to tie a bow tie for years. So there, in my desk, there were a few bow ties left over from when I was teaching at university. And at some point at one of the, oh gosh, I just did the European thing, didn't I? I was teaching at a university.
I heard you say it too.
It's easy to get lost in that too, right? Darn it, I go to a hospital, not to hospital. But anyway, I had a tie that I used to wear, and one day I put it on. My viewing audience, which at the time I probably had 1,000 subscribers, I don't know, it was early on, but they said, "Oh, that's awesome." And so it just kind of became a thing, became a brand.
That's your logo, right? Your logo.
It is the bow ties on the logo, and I do tie my own ties. The only time I've ever worn clip-ons on the air is if sometimes some people have sent me some, and like someone sent me a bunch of ties that their grandfather had worn and stuff like that. Some of those I wear them because it means something. I generally tie them. And the thing that I kind of like about them is part of my kind of vision of the channel was that there used to be lots of documentaries on. I grew up watching World at War and Victory at Sea and those sorts of documentaries. And so you get this idea where there's this sort of a dusty historian. He's not necessarily dusty, but he's usually like this old gray dude. He's sitting in this office called a junk in behind him, old books and stuff he's collected, and he's got a bow tie on, and he's kind of telling history. And I have a nostalgia for those, so I kind of like it. But I didn't originally come up with a bow tie. Just when people started liking the bow tie, I started wearing them, and then it became a thing. And then now if someone, and occasionally I'm not some big star, but occasionally I'm recognized in public. Usually someone will hear my voice and they'll say, "Oh, is that the history guy?" And they're always stunned to see me without the bow tie. The grocery store.
You don't just live in one?
I don't. I don't sleep in it. I don't wear it in the shower. I really people ask if I wear pants. I always wear pants. I've never done, you might not be wearing pants, but I usually don't bother to put on the suit pants because they don't see it. So I'm usually wearing jeans with my suit. And if I go out in public, I would put on, the pants that match the suit coat. The tie's it's just a thing. It has nothing to do, people will try to connect it to the Bill Nye, the science guy. It had nothing to do with that. I have to not down speaking Bill Nye at all. He's just not from my era. He became famous in a time when I wasn't paying attention to children's programming. So
yeah, we had Mr. Wizard.
Yeah, well, so who also sometimes wore a bow tie though.
Don.
So it had nothing to do with Bill Nye. I didn't even really know who he was. It was simply because I wore a bow tie one day. Someone liked it. I started wearing them all the time, and now I actually there's a place called the Tie Bar, and they make really nice bow ties, and they send me free bow ties just for wearing them on the air. And that's I know I've arrived. No matter what else happens in terms of number of subscribers and anything else. Someone is selling me bow ties just so that I can wear them, and that's success.
I like it. I bought some ties from the Tie Bar. They do make a nice product.
They're good quality, yeah. Before that, I have to say I was mostly buying cheap ties because you can't really tell on YouTube whether it's a cheap tie or a good tie. But there's a significant difference in how it looks in real life. And it's nice to have quality bow ties rather than the ones that are made out of the fake silk.
Those don't last that long.
Yeah.
Where do you want the channel to go? What's the?
I honestly don't know. I mean, we're diversifying right now. There's so much going on, and we're moving into podcasts, which we hadn't done before, and those are going to start producing very soon. And we're doing. We just started what is called Cameo. We just started this one the other day, so that someone can go on and they can pay a few dollars, and I'll say happy birthday to them. So I don't know. The philosophy of my channel has always been to tell stories that I enjoy and to make videos that I'd want to watch. And I have other writers, and I always just say, write what you want to write so that your passion comes through, and stick with that idea that history doesn't have to be boring. People will give us topic suggestions all the time. Sometimes they'll be upset if we don't write them. And I apologize. We just got so many, we couldn't possibly write them all. We got millions of topics stacked up. But I mean, I just want to pick something that I'm excited to write about, that I'm going to learn and then I write it and I learn things, and when I produce it, I'm having a great deal of fun. And 2 days later, I'm on to another topic, and I might have forgotten everything I just learned. But I mean, that fun is going to show through. So what I really want it to do is to continue to be a place where people say that history doesn't have to be boring, where people feel like they are having an enjoyable experience and that they're learning things. And I hope that it stays in the general idea that this isn't a guy who's trying to spin history. This is a guy who's trying to tell history. And those are philosophies that we've always had together. And aside from that, I don't know. I've had people say, oh, you should be on the History Channel, or I had a guy for a long time who was always sending me text messages that I should be the last 5 minutes of 60 Minutes. And they've never called. So
that's funny.
The History Channel did call, though. We did some stuff for the History Channel because their studios were shut down due to COVID. My studio's in my basement, and so we made some stuff for the History Channel because we could produce when no one else could.
That's awesome.
And so I just love where it's going, and I honestly don't know the future. I hope it continues to pay the rent. I do. I hope I can continue to do this until I retire, because this is a job that I love.
Do you still work another job, or you just?
No. This is my day job. Yeah, actually, that with me, what had happened is I was laid off from my day job, and I was working with Blue Cross actually, and because of stuff that happened with the Affordable Care Act, my division essentially became irrelevant overnight. So that'll happen with legislation. So but I had been with the company long enough that I had a pretty good package. So I had time to rethink and decide what to do. And it took some time, but I finally decided, this is what I want to do, and I'll try it. And we had the ability, the financial means to go the year before we made any money, and the year and a half before we made enough money that this was paying the bills.
Mm-hmm.
And after about 18 months, my wife was working. She's on the channel sometime, and people love her, and I love her obviously. But about 18 months in, I told her, because there were some things going on at her work. And I said, you don't have to work. We're making enough money here. You don't have to work. And she writes for me, and she's a partner in the business, and she does a lot of stuff with the channel, though it's my passion. It's not necessarily hers. So she has her other projects that she's doing too. And then now I'll tell you honestly, without, getting into numbers, I think I will come close to paying in federal income tax this year what I used to make working for the insurance company.
Good.
And so, no, I don't need another job. This was funny.
Good.
And it pays the rent. It does.
Well, there is always opportunity, especially here in this country. And people, I think, the saying I hate the most is "must be nice." People look at what we do and I hear "must be nice," but I know how much work you put in. And like you said, you get stuff wrong, but you get out there and keep cranking it out, and it's a great product. I share your videos from time to time on our Facebook page, and
thank you.
Share them with family members and stuff. Well, there is a lot of bad history out on the YouTube. People, misquoting, misrepresenting and such.
So there's a lot of bad, all sorts of stuff on YouTube, and there's some really terrible history. There's some stuff that I watch and I cross my eyes, and I have no idea how. And so I hope that, we're aiming for better. And the reason that I don't strap a GoPro to my cat and give up doing what I'm doing is because no insult to my cat, she's sitting right here. But the reason is because I want something that I can be proud of, and so I am trying to make something. We were on another YouTuber's channel, kind of like this, a few months ago, and he said, I look at a lot of people's channel, and their first episode, they're like walking a duck. And I don't know where he came up with walking a duck, but he said, I look at yours, and he says, your first stuff is actually pretty good. And I look at it, and it's a mess, because I didn't have any idea how to do the processing. The microphones were garbage. The lighting was terrible. But I did have an idea of what I wanted from the channel, and we've been lucky to stick with that idea. And we've been lucky that that's an idea that's gained some success. And there's certainly YouTubers 1,000 times my size. I think one of those sites that tracks that says I'm the 16,000th largest YouTube channel in America. So
I've got a few friends that are in the millions, and it's a lot of work. But you'll be there soon. You're over 900 now, right? I'm
over 900. It's slowed up, and it's slowed up partly because I think some of my audience is leaving YouTube, and that's one of the reasons we're diversifying. So we're still going up, but it's pretty slowly. I don't know when we're going to hit 1 million. Sometimes some days you're getting thousands of people in a day.
After this podcast, most likely.
Oh yeah, we'll get that clearly tens of thousands.
Millions. Now that being said, the people that are listening to this podcast should go give you a follow, because it's good material. I think rather than watching a cat with a GoPro, you should be learning something about the world. I've just had a kid on, young man, not a kid, that's a theoretical nuclear physicist, total dummy, and works at a lab down in New Mexico, working on his PhD, like people. He's got a huge YouTube following where he does these huge marker board calculations of physics, and people sit and watch him do it. He's got hundreds of thousands of people.
Wonderful. Because you had to be at the place to be able to see that, and now millions of people can access that. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. But also people that could go write junk on that whiteboard could also go up on YouTube, and you just got to be picky about what you're watching. But I agree with you. There's a lot of junk on YouTube in a lot of different ways. And we like what we're doing. We like the length of what we're doing. We like the type of stories that we're telling. And I follow that rule that says I make videos I would watch. And I hope that reaches as much audience as it's going to reach. I know that there's people who think I talk too fast or aren't interested in history or whatever, and I don't expect to get everybody. But I hope that I all the time. It is the web. We get terrible, mean things all the time too. But
sure.
But all the time we get people who say, I hated history in high school and now I've learned to love it and thank you. Or just the other day, someone posted one said, "You made 2020 bearable." That's awesome. That's what I want to do. If we're doing that even for a few thousands of people or a few hundreds of thousands of people, it might not be huge according to the world, but it means that I think I'm accomplishing what I hope to accomplish, and that's what fantastic. I want to do. I just hope that I do hope it supports the family and pays for the cat food and sends my daughter to college. But I just hope that it's valuable to the people who watch it, and that's what we're trying to do.
I like it. I ask people before we close these podcasts, if you never met the people that you're talking to, if you never crossed their path, if they never watch your channel, what would you leave them with?
Wow, that's an interesting question. My core message when I get to it, I put in some things I really most believe about it. Whatever we're going through now, we've gone through worse, and we'll make it through, and we'll be fine. And that's one of the reasons that we understand history. But my core message has always been: history doesn't have to be boring. And if you think that history is boring, then go find the stories of history. You're going to find out they're better than superhero movies. I don't mean to make fun of anybody's superhero movies, but I'll tell you, every movie I've ever seen, I got a better plot line somewhere in history. That's truth is stranger than fiction. And so my message is: don't just write it off because someone was making you memorize dates in high school. Go find the stories that are compelling to you, and you'll find out that those can be so enlightening as well as entertaining, and just a great way to spend your life. So if you think history shouldn't be boring, then come check out The History Guy on YouTube and Facebook, and we even sell T-shirts on Teespring if you want a History Guy T-shirt. But if you think history shouldn't be boring, go check us out, because we don't think history should be boring, and I think that we'll have stories that you find interesting.
I like it. I appreciate your time. You're very passionate about what you do. You and your wife got a good thing going. Don't put a GoPro on the cat.
Don't put a GoPro. Well, we might do that anyway, just because. Well, they wouldn't know.
Just for family footage.
Actually, just for the family fun. Yeah, cat. They sleep all day. If I put a GoPro on her, she's the 12 hours of that at least would be her laying in the same spot. But that's not going to be my YouTube channel now. We're going to continue to tell stories of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes, and hopefully until I'm too old to talk. That's my goal.
So you got many, many years of History Guy in front of you.
We will never run out of topics. Yeah,
that's true.
Always keep up the pace of 3 a week, one every other day. I don't know if we're always going to keep that up. I have to say, because I hope I get vacation sometime. But I hope I keep telling stories. And I don't think I'll ever run out of stories.
I appreciate your time. You guys that watched, listened, you guys should share this podcast if you enjoyed it.
Absolutely, we will. When you post this up, tell where it is. We'll put it out.
I'm telling the viewers too, but you can share it too.
But I will too. My viewers too. When this comes out, this has been a lot of fun. And look up Mickey and check out his stuff, because he's got some great perspective here. And this was a lot of fun. So maybe we'll share each other's stuff, because we both have things to say.
I appreciate that, sir. You guys that viewed, we appreciate you. Be well. Happy New Year, depending on when you're listening to this. Good 2020. Visit our website, CarryTrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., CarryTrainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@CarryTrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@CarryTrainer.com or CarryTrainer.com.
Hey Steve, what do you think of gunfighter gun oil?
Well, Mick, I have to show you about that. Gunfighter lube. Baby, I had the gunfighter blues. But then I got me some gunfighter lube. Let me tell you about it. Made in the USA, amazing lubricity, amazing adhesion, baby. 100% synthetic, but it's gonna last you. Gunfighter gun oil, baby. Took away my gunfighter blues. I'm still working on it, but you know,
So you like the lube?
it's the best.